As the Second World War ended, a Cold War began between the United States and Soviet Union. It was a Cold War in the sense that the two sides were never firing directly at one another, but the two remaining superpowers would battle for superiority when it came to influence in different parts of the world, like Greece, Turkey, Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, to name a few. They battled in the race to space, Sputnik, Gagarin, Shepard, and Neil Armstrong, and they battled to see who could have the most deadly nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, Atlas and Titan intercontinental ballistic missiles, enough to destroy the world. This conflict would start at the end of World War II and last for 45 years. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, and Bush Jr. would have a role in the Cold War. Today we will look at the outcomes of World War II and the early containment policy that would define the Cold War for the United States. It's Cold War, Part 1. There were many important developments at the end of World War II, like the Soviet Union expanding its control over Central and Eastern Europe. Countries like Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Yugoslavia would become satellite countries under the control of the Soviet Union. Germany, defeated by the Allies, was divided into 4 sectors, split between Britain, France, the United States, the Soviet Union. Berlin in the Soviet sector will also be divided. It will become a source of conflict. More on that in a minute. Ultimately, the country would be divided into West Germany and East Germany. West Germany was the British, French, and United States sectors. West Germany was allowed to govern itself and had a democratic government. East Germany was the Soviet sector and would become a communist state. And after the war, Japan was occupied by the United States. There were Tokyo war crimes trials where 7 Japanese generals, including Hideki Tojo, were tried and executed. The Japanese set up a new constitution that gave Japan a very limited military. Japan would have to depend on the United States for military protection. It would become a major ally for the United States in Asia. The American military presence and role in Japan continues today. At the war's end, the United Nations was created. Like the League of Nations at the end of World War I, the United Nations was created to help maintain world peace. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations would last, still playing a role in the world today. One of the first things that the UN did was create the country of Israel, a homeland for the Jewish people in the Middle East. This was one of the few issues that the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on. Of course, the creation of Israel in the middle of the Middle East has been a source of tension in the region since its creation in 1948 between Israelis and Palestinians. In the post-war world, the United States and Soviet Union were the 2 superpowers in the world, and both had very different views on how the world should go after World War II. The democratic United States, the totalitarian Soviet Union with a communist economy whose goal was to spread communism. The capitalist United States, who believed in the power of the free market. The Soviet Union wanted to use Eastern Europe as a means to rebuild its economy after the war. The United States wanted Germany reunited. The Soviet Union wanted it to be divided so as to provide a buffer between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. The United States wanted a stable Europe that was able to choose its own governments so that it would be open to trade with the United States. The Soviet Union wanted a divided Europe so that it would have a way to balance American influence in the West. So all of this led to the Cold War, which was an ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism, capitalism and communism. This Cold War would last from the end of World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And while it was a Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fighting each other, there were different battlefields in this ideological struggle, like the buildup of nuclear weapons, the race to space, and in countries emerging from colonial control. Right after World War II, like after World War I, Europe lay in ruins. 4 years of brutal conflict created much physical, economic, and psychological damage to the continent from England through Poland into Soviet Union. In order to help Europe, the United States Secretary of State George Marshall offered economic aid to the countries of Europe. This was known as the Marshall Plan. All told, the United States loaned $13 billion to 16 European countries that helped revive Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. The United States also wanted to prevent these countries from turning to communism while they were potentially vulnerable after the war. The map shows where the money went: $2.8 billion to Great Britain, $2.4 billion to France, $1.3 billion to Italy, and so on. The United States offered money to Eastern Europe and even the Soviet Union, who turned down the money. The Soviet Union obviously would not take American money, and Eastern Europe was told not to take the money by Joseph Stalin. For the United States, the Marshall Plan led to the United States gaining strong allies in Western Europe. Also, the economic relationship led to increased industrial and agricultural output from Europe, who was in need of these goods right after the war, that would fuel the post-war economic boom in the United States. In a famous speech given in 1946, Winston Churchill, the wartime leader of Britain, claimed that an iron curtain had descended across the European continent with a clear Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Countries like Albania, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland were part of the Soviet sphere, thus controlled by the Soviet Union. George Kennan was an American diplomat who came up with the idea of containment. This policy stated that the United States needed to do whatever it took to stop the spread of communism into other countries. The goal was not to rid the world of communism, but to stop its spread. This policy of containment would dominate American foreign policy during the Cold War. It would be the reason why the United States got involved in Turkey and Greece. Later, and they'll get involved in Korea, and later on, they'll get involved in Vietnam, all under the guise of containment. The first opportunity to use this containment policy was in Turkey and Greece. Both of these countries were being threatened by communist forces after World War II, and President Truman declared, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." In order to prevent a communist takeover in Turkey and Greece, the United States gave $400 million to Greece and Turkey, and the Truman Doctrine was born. A major issue after World War II was the reunification of the divided Germany. The United States, French, and British wanted Germany reunified, but the Soviet Union was resistant. Berlin was in the Soviet sector, but was also divided. And when Stalin put up a blockade, the first major conflict of the Cold War emerged, as supplies could not get into the people of West Berlin. In response, Truman ordered planes to fly food and supplies to the people of West Berlin, day after day, month after month. And this continued for 11 months, and Truman also sent 60 bombers capable of carrying atomic bombs to bases in England. By May 1949, Stalin ended the blockade. The crisis in Berlin ensured that Germany would remain separate. As tensions continued to rise, there was a need to seek alliances. In response to the threats of Soviet expansion, the United States formed an alliance with 10 Western European countries and Canada. This alliance was known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These countries agreed that if one country was attacked, it was like an attack on all. NATO was committed to stopping communism. The Soviet Union formed its own defensive alliance in 1955, known as the Warsaw Pact, with 7 countries in Eastern Europe. And for nearly half a century, these alliances would have large military forces ready for war in Europe. Next time, we will consider the Cold War in China, Korea. We'll look at weapons designed to destroy the enemy, and a couple of events right off the coast of Florida and Cuba. And until then, good night, Albuquerque.